Judge Aaron Miles sat comfortably behind the wheel of his car, the hum of the engine a low, steady rhythm. The evening was peaceful, the kind of quiet that settles over small towns late at night, when most people have already retreated to their homes. He had just left a community fundraiser for underprivileged youth, an event that had gone better than expected. He had given a heartfelt speech about hope, perseverance, and justice, topics close to him both as a person and as a judge. Afterward, he lingered to chat with attendees, soaking in the sense of unity that the evening had inspired. Now, driving home, the streets were nearly empty. The warm glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the road as he loosened his tie, allowing himself a rare moment of relaxation. His mind wandered to his family, his wife and children, who were likely already asleep at home. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Moments like this were rare, offering a chance to unwind, reflect, and appreciate the journey he had taken, from humble beginnings to becoming one of the youngest judges appointed in the state. Just as he reached for the radio to put on some music, a sudden flash of red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror. The serene smile faded from his face, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety. He glanced at the speedometer. He was well within the limit, and his car was in perfect working order. There was no reason he should have been pulled over, yet the lights continued to flash, demanding his attention. Judge Miles sighed softly and signaled as he pulled his car to the side of the road. His thoughts raced, but he quickly calmed himself. He had done nothing wrong. This was probably just a routine stop. Still, experience had taught him that such encounters could be unpredictable, especially for a black man driving alone at night. As the police cruiser came to a stop behind him, Judge Miles reached for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license and judicial identification card. He had heard countless stories about how important it was to have everything ready, minimizing any chance of misunderstanding. Keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, he waited. In the rearview mirror, he saw the officer get out of the patrol car, walking briskly toward him. The officer was tall, broad-shouldered, and white, his dark uniform blending with the night. His face was set in a frown, eyes narrowed with suspicion. The officer knocked on the window, and Miles rolled it down smoothly, letting the cool night air into the car, along with a sudden tension. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his tone clipped and sharp. Miles shook his head calmly. "No, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was measured, polite, the tone he had perfected in the courtroom when handling sensitive cases. The officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted around the interior of the car before settling back on Judge Miles, his brow furrowed. "License and registration," the officer demanded bluntly. Without hesitation, Miles handed over his documents, including his judicial ID. "Here's my license, registration, and my identification. I'm Judge Aaron Miles." The officer barely glanced at the documents at first, his gaze lingering on Miles as though trying to assess him. Finally, he flipped through the papers, pausing briefly when he saw the judicial ID. His expression didn't change, but there was a noticeable hesitation. "You're a judge, huh?" the officer asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, I am," Miles replied, maintaining his calm despite sensing where this conversation was headed. He had encountered this skepticism before, polite enough on the surface but with an undercurrent of doubt. "Where are you headed tonight, Judge?" The word judge sounded less like a title and more like a taunt. "I'm headed home. I just left a community event downtown," Miles answered, keeping the exchange as straightforward as possible. The officer leaned in slightly, as if getting closer would somehow make Miles's answers more truthful. "A community event?" he repeated, eyes narrowing further. "Do you mind stepping out of the car for a minute?" Miles blinked, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. A routine stop usually ended with an explanation or maybe a citation, not a request to exit the vehicle. But he knew all too well that complying with police requests, no matter how unnecessary they seemed, was often the safest choice. He couldn't afford to let this turn into something worse. "Of course," he said, though a faint unease stirred within him. He opened the door and stepped out, careful to keep his hands visible and avoid any sudden movements. The officer took a step back, resting his hand on the holster of his weapon, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Miles. He had seen this scene play out before. In court, in testimony after testimony, stories of simple traffic stops that escalated into something far more dangerous. As he stood beside his car, the officer motioned for him to move to the front of the vehicle. "Stand right here," he ordered. Miles complied, standing in front of his car, the headlights illuminating him like a spotlight, making him feel exposed. The officer's eyes were still on him, studying him as though he were a suspect in a crime that hadn't even been committed. "What's this all about?" Miles asked, keeping his voice steady despite the rising tension. He knew this wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. This was something else, something more insidious. The officer didn't answer at first. Instead, he took a step back, eyeing Judge Miles with the same skepticism he had from the start. "You sure this ID is real?" he asked, holding up the judicial identification card like it was a trinket from a novelty shop. A flash of frustration crossed Miles's mind, but he tamped it down. "It's real. I've been a judge in this county for nearly 10 years, he replied calmly. The officer's face remained hard, unconvinced. "You don't really look like a judge," he said, the words weighted with unspoken meaning. Miles held his ground, meeting the officer's gaze. He could feel the familiar weight of prejudice settling over the encounter, turning what should have been a simple traffic stop into something else entirely. The officer's skepticism wasn't about legality, it was about perception, who belonged in positions of power and who didn't. And in this officer's eyes, Aaron Miles didn't fit the image of someone who belonged. Miles knew this wasn't a fight he could win with words, so he stayed silent, waiting to see how far the officer would push things. The night air felt heavier as Judge Miles stood by his car, bathed in the harsh glow of the headlights. Though his heartbeat was steady, it had quickened. The officer's scrutiny, combined with the tension in the air, had turned what should have been a brief exchange into something far more troubling. "Where are you coming from?" The officer, his name tag read Mike Reynolds, asked again, his tone more abrasive now, as if the title of judge meant nothing to him. He leaned closer, his hand resting with quiet intent on his belt. It was a subtle gesture, but to Judge Miles it carried a world of meaning, an unspoken threat, a reminder of who was really in control. "I told you, officer. I'm coming from a community event, a fundraiser for local youth," Miles responded, his voice calm, though each word felt heavier. He knew that anything he said could either diffuse or escalate the situation. Years of courtroom experience had taught him how to navigate tense interactions, but this was different. In the courtroom, he had authority backed by the law. Here on a dark road, he was just another black man facing a skeptical white officer. Reynolds narrowed his eyes as though weighing whether or not Miles was telling the truth. His face was a mask of suspicion. Though he hadn't said it outright, his body language made it clear he didn't believe him. "A fundraiser, huh?" The officer's tone dripped with sarcasm, as if the idea of Aaron Miles being involved in anything positive was preposterous. Judge Miles shifted slightly but kept his hands visible. "Yes, a fundraiser," he repeated. His patience was wearing thin, but he couldn't afford to let his frustration show. He had seen how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. He had read about it, watched videos, and heard countless stories from people in his community who had gone through similar experiences. The difference was, they weren't judges. They didn't have the privilege of a title that might have shielded them, on any other night, from a situation like this. Reynolds finally straightened up, moving his hand away from his belt. But the look on his face told Miles that this wasn't over. "Do you mind if I take a look inside your car, Judge?" The way he said "Judge" was laced with disbelief, as though the very idea of the man standing in front of him holding any authority was a joke. Miles felt a surge of frustration. "Is that really necessary, officer? I've given you my license, my identification. I've told you where I'm coming from and where I'm headed. What more do you need?" His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to his words now. Reynolds stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "I need to be sure, Judge. People say a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're telling the truth." Miles clenched his jaw. He knew where this was heading. Refusing the officer's request would likely make things worse. He had seen how quickly suspicion could turn into confrontation. This officer wasn't asking. He was testing him, pushing him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. "Go ahead," Miles said finally, his voice tight with frustration. He hated the words as they left his mouth, but what choice did he have? The officer would search his car either way, and resisting would only escalate the situation. Reynolds gave a curt nod and moved toward the car. Miles watched as the officer opened the door and began methodically searching the interior. The search was quick and pointless. Miles knew there was nothing to find, just his briefcase, a few papers, and a coat draped over the back seat. Still, Reynolds took his time, checking the glove compartment, peering under the seats, even rifling through the papers in the briefcase, none of which held any significance. After several long minutes, Reynolds closed the car door, seemingly unsatisfied. He turned back to Miles with a frown, as though annoyed that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. "Looks like everything checks out," the officer muttered, though his tone didn't soften. It was clear he was still grappling with the idea that the man he had stopped wasn't who he had assumed him to be. Miles remained silent. Any attempt to engage in conversation at this point would likely only deepen the officer's mistrust. But Reynolds wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Miles again, narrowing his eyes. "You say you're a judge? I find that hard to believe. Judges don't usually drive around like this, especially not this late at night." It was a comment Miles had heard many times before, though rarely this direct. There was always an undercurrent of disbelief, a subtle implication that a black man couldn't possibly hold such a position. It didn't matter how many years he had worked to get here or how many cases he had presided over. To this officer, Aaron Miles didn't fit the image of a judge, and that was enough to cast doubt over everything else. Judge Miles straightened his shoulders, refusing to let the comment shake his composure. "I've been a judge in this county for nearly 10 years, officer," Judge Miles said, his voice steady but with an edge now. "I've handled cases far more complicated than this interaction. I'm just trying to get home, and I'm not sure why we're still having this conversation." Reynolds smirked, his expression chilling in its dismissiveness. "A judge, huh? Sure doesn't seem like it." His voice had dropped to a near whisper, but the weight of his words hung in the air. For the first time that night, Judge Miles felt a sharp pang of anger rise in his chest. It was one thing to be cautious, to follow procedure, but this officer wasn't interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind about who Judge Miles was, and no amount of explanation or evidence was going to change that. Reynolds glanced down at the documents in his hand one last time before speaking. "I'm going to run these through the system just to be sure. You stay right here." As the officer walked back to his cruiser, Judge Miles took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew this was more than just a traffic stop. It was a test of how far Officer Reynolds would go to prove a point. How long he would cling to his belief that Miles didn't belong in the role he had earned. Minutes passed as Miles stood by his car, his body stiff with frustration. Through the windshield of the cruiser, he could see Reynolds typing into the onboard computer. The night had grown quieter, with only the soft rustle of trees and distant traffic breaking the silence. A car passed by slowly, the occupants craning their necks to get a glimpse of what was happening. One of them pulled out a phone, possibly to take a picture or video. It was a reminder that this incident could easily go public, yet another story of a black man being stopped by police for no apparent reason. Judge Miles had spent his entire career fighting against the systemic injustices that plagued people of color, and now here he was facing it firsthand. He had seen too many cases of young men caught in the system because someone decided they didn't belong. And now, as the minutes dragged on, Miles realized this was no longer just about getting home. It was about principle. He couldn't let this moment define him. nor could he allow Officer Reynolds to think his actions were justified. Miles stood beside his car, hands calmly at his sides, though every muscle in his body was tense. The night air had turned colder, seeping through the fabric of his suit as he waited. He knew deep down that Reynolds was stalling, searching for any excuse to prolong this charade. This wasn't about the law anymore, if it ever had been. It was about power, control, and the assumptions the officer had made the moment he saw a black man in an expensive car, late at night. The police cruiser's lights flashed ominously, a beacon of authority that only added to the tension. Miles glanced around, noticing a small crowd gathering just a block away. 2 more people had pulled out their phones, recording from a distance. Even without knowing the full story, they could sense something wasn't right. As a judge, Miles had spent years mastering his emotions, maintaining calm in even the most heated situations. But here, he was no longer in control. He wasn't in a courtroom with the power to command respect. Here, on the side of a dimly lit road, he was just another black man being interrogated for no reason. The stop had escalated so quickly, the questions, the suspicion. He had presided over cases like this, seen outcomes far worse than his. The faces of those young men flickered in his mind, ghosts haunting him as he waited. From inside the cruiser, Reynolds tapped away at his computer. It was taking far longer than necessary to confirm Miles's identity. The officer already had all the information he needed: license, registration, judicial ID. This was just another power play. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Reynolds emerged from the cruiser, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly toward Judge Miles, the weight of his authority evident in every step. In his hand, he held a pair of handcuffs. Miles stiffened, his heart skipping a beat. He had prepared for a frustrating encounter, but not this. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Reynolds said, his voice steady but cold. Judge Miles blinked in disbelief, momentarily frozen. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, but the incredulity was unmistakable. "You heard me. Turn around. Hands behind your back," Reynolds repeated, stepping closer. The small crowd watching from a distance grew louder, murmurs of confusion and outrage rippling through the onlookers. Phones zoomed in, capturing every moment. "What's the charge?" Miles asked, his voice still measured, though the anger was rising. This had gone far beyond a simple stop. This was an abuse of power. "Failure to comply with an officer's orders," Reynolds said, his gaze unwavering, "and providing false identification." Miles couldn't believe what he was hearing. False identification? He had given the officer his real name, his real ID. He had been nothing but cooperative, but none of that mattered to Reynolds. The officer had already decided what he wanted to believe. "False identification?" Miles repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You've seen my ID. You know who I am." Reynolds didn't respond. Instead, he reached for Miles's arm, pulling it behind his back with unnecessary force. The judge tensed as the cold bite of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. It wasn't the first time he had seen handcuffs, but it was the first time they had been placed on him. As the metal locked into place, something inside him shifted. Judge Aaron Miles had seen too many men in these very same handcuffs, sitting in his courtroom, recounting how their lives had been turned upside down by a single encounter with law enforcement. He had always tried to show empathy, understanding their fear and frustration, but standing in their shoes now, he felt it in a way he never had before. As Officer Reynolds grabbed his other arm and roughly locked the second cuff into place, for the first time in his career, Miles felt the crushing weight of the system he had worked within for so many years. It was suffocating, a visceral reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control when someone else held the power to judge you. Across the street, the crowd erupted in protest, their voices rising against the injustice unfolding before them. "He's a judge, not a criminal," a woman shouted, her voice cutting through the night air. Yet Officer Reynolds paid no attention to the voices or the cameras capturing every second. His focus remained on Miles, his grip firm as he led the judge toward the squad car. The flashing red and blue lights painted long shadows on the pavement as they moved. "Get in the car," Reynolds ordered, opening the cruiser's back door. Judge Miles paused, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, hear the rising anger in their voices, but he knew he had no choice. Resisting, even slightly, could turn this into something far worse. With a deep breath, he ducked his head and stepped into the cramped back seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The small space was stifling, the handcuffs biting into his wrists as a constant reminder of the reality he now faced. The authority he commanded in his courtroom felt distant, almost surreal. Through the window, the protest of the crowd continued, though the voices grew fainter as Reynolds walked back to his patrol car. The entire situation felt unreal, like a nightmare playing out in slow motion. This wasn't supposed to happen to him, not after everything he had worked for. And yet here he was, handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, indistinguishable from the countless defendants who had stood before him in court. As he sat in the cruiser, Miles couldn't help but think of his family, his wife, his children. What would they think when they heard about this? Would they see the video that was already likely making the rounds online? The thought gnawed at him, but he forced himself to focus. He had to stay composed. This wasn't over yet. From the front seat, Reynolds started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the car. He glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Miles's eyes briefly. "You're making a big mistake," Miles said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of warning. "When this is all over, you'll understand what you've done." Reynolds didn't respond, instead shifting the car into gear and pulling away from the curb, the red and blue lights still flashing as they drove toward the station. Miles stared out the window, watching the town blur past, his mind spinning. The handcuffs were a constant, inescapable reminder of the injustice he was now trapped in. He had spent his life fighting for justice, defending those wrongfully accused or mistreated by the system. Now, for the first time, he was the one on the other side, and the irony of it all was almost unbearable. The drive to the station was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the crackle of the police radio. Miles closed his eyes, trying to center himself, pushing away the anger and frustration that threatened to consume him. He had to think clearly. Losing control now wouldn't help. When they arrived, the station's harsh fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over the quiet building. Officer Reynolds parked the cruiser and opened the back door, roughly pulling Miles out. Inside, the station was nearly empty, only a few officers milling about. But as they saw who Reynolds was bringing in, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. "Is that Judge Miles?" one officer whispered, his voice tinged with shock. The murmurs grew louder, more officers gathering around as Reynolds led Miles toward the booking desk. Their expressions were a mix of confusion, disbelief, and unease. This wasn't a typical arrest, and they all knew it. Miles kept his composure, his face betraying none of the storm swirling inside him. He knew what was coming. The booking process, the photos, the paperwork. He had seen it all before. But now, being on this side of the process felt like stepping into a different world, one where his authority, his reputation, meant nothing. As Reynolds prepared to process him, a senior officer, Sergeant Jenkins, stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mike, what the hell is going on?" "That's Judge Miles." Reynolds didn't flinch. "I caught him providing false identification. He's resisting the investigation." Jenkins looked between Reynolds and Miles, his disbelief palpable. "False identification? Are you serious? That's Aaron Miles. He's been on the bench for nearly 10 years. Reynolds shrugged, his face impassive. "We'll sort it out, but for now he's under arrest." Jenkins stared at Reynolds for a long moment before turning to Judge Miles. "Judge, do you want to make a phone call?" "I'll wait," Miles said, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't going to rush this. Not yet. Jenkins hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed, but eventually nodded. All right, but this better get sorted out quick. As they moved through the booking process, Miles's mind churned. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger, something that went far beyond a single traffic stop. The system wasn't just broken. It was rigged, and tonight he was living proof. Later, as Judge Aaron Miles sat in the holding cell, the cold metal bench beneath him stark and uncomfortable, he stared at the gray concrete walls around him. The sterile light overhead buzzed faintly, casting long shadows. The oppressive feel of the room seemed to echo the indifference of the system that had ensnared him. He had once believed in the power of justice. But tonight, he understood in the deepest way possible how fragile that belief could be. Judge Aaron Miles had been inside many jails before, but never like this. Never as a detainee. His hands, now free from the handcuffs, rested in his lap, his wrists still aching from where the metal had bitten into his skin. The physical pain was nothing compared to the indignity he had just endured. It wasn't the first time he had felt the sting of racism in his life, but this was different. This was raw, public, and deeply personal. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, but despite the injustice, a quiet determination simmered within him. He scanned the small, impersonal cell with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years within the justice system. It was a standard holding cell, stripped of anything that might give a person a sense of individuality. In here, you weren't a person. You were just another detainee, another case number waiting to be processed. And tonight, that number belonged to him. Outside the bars, the station hummed with activity. Officers moved about, their voices low, but a few whispered in hushed tones about the situation. Some knew who was inside, while others were simply unaware that the man behind the bars was a judge who had once presided over cases just like this one. Snippets of conversation drifted into the cell, fragments of disbelief and confusion. "That's the judge, right? What's he doing here?" Reynolds arrested him. "For what? This is going to blow up in all of our faces." Miles didn't need to hear the full conversations to know what was being said. He had been a respected figure in the legal community for years, and his arrest had already sparked uncertainty within the station. But explaining himself wasn't his priority. Not yet. There was a point to be made, and he intended to make it. He could have called his lawyer. He could have demanded to speak to the police chief or used his connections to have the charges dropped immediately. In fact, several officers had already approached him, offering to make a few calls to clear this whole thing up. But Judge Miles had refused. He wanted to see this through, to experience firsthand what so many others had faced, especially the young black men who stood before him in court, enduring the system's weight. He needed to know just how deep the rot in the system went. As the minutes dragged on, turning into an hour, the station remained quieter than usual for a weekend night. But Miles knew that at any moment, things could escalate. He had no idea how far this would go, but he was prepared for whatever came next. His thoughts drifted back to his courtroom and the defendants he had sentenced. How many of them had felt like this, assumed guilty before they even had a chance to speak? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Jenkins appeared on the other side of the bars, his face a mixture of apology and confusion. "Judge Miles," Jenkins began, his voice low and hesitant. "We're working on getting this sorted out. This whole thing is, well, a misunderstanding, to say the least." Miles regarded him with a calm, measured gaze. "A misunderstanding, Sergeant? Is that what we're calling it now?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I know this isn't right. Reynolds was out of line, we all know that. But we've got to go through the process. You know how it is. If you want, I can call the chief. He's already on his way, but I can speed things up, get you out of here." Judge Miles leaned back slightly, his eyes still fixed on Jenkins. "I appreciate the offer, Sergeant, but I'm not interested in shortcuts. Not tonight." Jenkins frowned, clearly baffled. "You don't have to stay here, sir. We can have you out in—" "I said I'll wait," Miles interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. He wasn't angry at Jenkins. The man was just following orders, trying to smooth over a situation that was spiraling out of control. But that wasn't the point. The point was to expose the truth, to let the system show itself for what it was. Jenkins hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. A judge refusing to leave a holding cell, even when offered an easy way out, was not something he had ever encountered. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right, Judge, if that's what you want." As Jenkins turned to leave, Miles called after him, his voice softening. "Sergeant?" Jenkins paused, glancing back. "Do you think Reynolds would have treated me the same if I weren't black?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. Jenkins's face tightened, his jaw clenching slightly. He knew the answer, but voicing it would make it real. I don't know, sir," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I really don't know." Miles nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's what I thought." Jenkins left, the heavy door clanging shut behind him, the sound echoing through the small room. Time ticked by, each minute stretching longer than the last. The station had quieted again, though every now and then, an officer would glance toward the holding cell, unsure what to make of the man sitting inside. Word had spread, and a tension hung in the air as if everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Eventually, the station door swung open, and in walked Police Chief Nathan Harris, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a stern expression. He was accompanied by Officer Jenkins, and together they made their way over to the holding cell. Harris's face was tight with frustration and concern, though it wasn't clear whether his anger was directed at Officer Reynolds, Judge Miles, or the situation as a whole. "Judge Miles," Harris said as he approached, his voice low and authoritative. "I'm here to get this sorted out." Miles looked up, his expression calm, though his eyes were sharp. "Chief Harris, I figured I'd be seeing you soon." Harris let out a slow breath, clearly trying to keep his emotions in check. Judge Aaron Miles stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the police station, calm on the outside but simmering with anger and frustration inside. The cuffs were off, but the emotional weight of what had happened pressed heavily on him. It wasn't just about his wrongful arrest. It was about all the black men who didn't have the privilege of being a judge, who faced the same or worse without the protections he had. Sergeant Jenkins had expedited the paperwork for his release, and now, just hours after his unjust arrest, Judge Miles was free to go. But walking out quietly wasn't on his agenda. This was about more than a mistake. It was about the systemic injustice faced by countless others who didn't have the ability or platform to speak out. The station buzzed with quiet tension. Officers moved through the room, their conversations hushed, and many cast glances at the judge. Word of his arrest had spread quickly, and the bystander video had already gone viral. The police knew what was coming: public outrage, investigations, and pressure from the media. The arrest of a black judge wasn't something they could sweep under the rug. Miles stood tall as Police Chief Nathan Harris approached him. Harris had been in damage control mode since the moment he arrived, apologizing and trying to manage the situation as delicately as possible. But apologies weren't enough anymore. What had happened couldn't be undone with words. "Judge Miles," Harris began, his voice low, almost pleading. "I understand how difficult this has been. I've spoken to Officer Reynolds, and he's been placed on leave pending the investigation. This isn't how we do things, and I want you to know we're taking this very seriously." Miles met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about Officer Reynolds, Chief. This is about a system that allows officers like him to assume that people like me don't belong. Do you think I'm the first person he's treated this way? Do you think this is the first time a black man has been wrongfully arrested in this town?" Harris faltered, the weight of Miles's words settling over him. He knew the judge was right, but admitting it out loud was harder than issuing apologies. "I can't speak to his past behavior," Harris said carefully, "but I can assure you this will be investigated thoroughly. Reynolds will face consequences." Miles shook his head slightly, his tone steady but unyielding. Consequences for one officer won't change the system. This isn't about punishing one man, Chief. It's about addressing the culture that lets this happen over and over again. I'm leaving here tonight. But what about the next black man who walks down the street and gets stopped for no reason? Will he have a fair chance? Harris was silent for a moment, his eyes reflecting a mix of guilt and helplessness. You're right, he admitted. I don't know how to fix this overnight, but I can start by making sure it doesn't get buried. You have my word on that. Miles nodded, though his heart was heavy. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere. Hold your officers accountable, Chief. Not just for this incident, but for the way they think and act every day. The two men stood in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. Harris finally extended his hand, and Miles, after a pause, took it. The handshake wasn't a resolution, but perhaps the beginning of something bigger. As Chief Harris and Sergeant Jenkins turned to leave, Judge Miles remained still, his mind racing with thoughts of everything that had transpired. This wasn't the end. The system wouldn't change easily or quickly, but this moment, this incident, might spark something. Maybe, just maybe, it would push people to look more closely at the injustice woven into the very fabric of their town. When the door closed behind them, Miles sat back on the bench. Alone with his thoughts, he knew there was still a long road ahead. Change was slow, but it was possible. And tonight, he had taken the first step in making sure that change began. He stood under the flickering lights, preparing to leave the station for good. But as he did, he knew that this night, this arrest, would not be forgotten. The weight of what happened would stay with him, just as the system's flaws had stayed with so many others for so long. But now there was a chance, no matter how small, that things could begin to shift. Harris shifted uncomfortably as Judge Aaron Miles continued, his voice calm but firm. We do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen, Harris said. And yet it did, Miles interrupted. Despite your policies, despite your training, despite everything that's supposedly in place to prevent this, it still happened. And it will happen again unless something changes. The chief looked down, clearly grappling with how to respond. He wasn't a bad man. Miles knew that. But he was part of a system designed to protect those in power, while criminalizing those seen as outsiders. Harris, too, was caught in the machine, just as much a victim of its design as the people it targeted. I'm not asking for Officer Reynolds to lose his job, Miles said, surprising the chief. Firing him won't fix the problem. You'll just replace him with someone else trained in the same flawed system. What I'm asking for is real accountability, real reform. You need to take a hard look at your department, the way your officers are trained, the way they interact with the community. Because if this can happen to me, a judge, imagine what's happening to people who don't have the privilege of my title. Harris nodded slowly, digesting Miles's words. I hear you, he said softly. I hear you, and I agree. We need to do better. But it's not going to happen overnight. Change takes time. I know that, Miles replied, his tone measured. But time is something we're running out of. You're going to have to act fast, because the world is watching now. This isn't just about me anymore. This story is everywhere and people are going to want answers. As if on cue, the front door of the station swung open. A small crowd of protesters had gathered outside, many holding signs. News vans lined the street, cameras trained on the station, waiting for the next development. The distant chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through the air, growing louder with each passing minute. Chief Harris glanced toward the door, his face tight with concern. The media's already here. We need to manage this carefully. You can't manage this, Chief, Miles said, stepping closer. You need to own this. Acknowledge what's wrong and take responsibility for fixing it. Because if you don't, this will just become another story of injustice. Another moment where the system failed to protect the people it's supposed to serve. Harris exhaled slowly, clearly wrestling with the gravity of the situation. We'll be holding a press conference, he said. I'm planning to address the media and the community. Explain what happened and outline what steps we're taking moving forward. Good, Miles replied. But it can't just be words, Chief. People need to see action. Real, tangible action. The chief nodded, but before he could respond, a loud voice from outside the station cut through the air. There he is. That's the judge. A group of reporters had gathered near the entrance, cameras flashing as they caught sight of Judge Miles inside. Harris exchanged a quick glance with Miles. Are you ready for this? Miles straightened his tie, his expression steeled with determination. I've been ready for this my whole life. The two men walked toward the door, the noise from the crowd swelling as they stepped outside, protesters holding signs with slogans like "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for All," momentarily quieted when they saw Miles and Harris emerge. The air was thick with anticipation. Chief Harris stepped forward first, addressing the crowd and the media. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of nervousness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I want to start by acknowledging that tonight's incident involving Judge Aaron Miles should not have happened. It was a failure on the part of this department, and for that I take full responsibility. The crowd murmured in response, the tension palpable. Officer Reynolds has been placed on immediate leave pending a thorough investigation, Harris continued. But I want to make it clear that this department is committed to transparency and accountability. We will review our policies, and we will ensure that incidents like this never happen again. A few scattered cheers emerged from the crowd, but most remained silent, waiting for something more. Harris turned toward Judge Miles, giving him the floor. Judge Miles stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the crowd. He took a moment to survey the sea of faces, black, white, young, old, all waiting for him to speak. He had to say something that would make sense of the injustice they had witnessed. I was reminded tonight of something I've known my entire life, he began, his voice clear and steady, that no matter who you are, no matter what title you hold, no matter how much you've accomplished, there are still people who will see you as less simply because of the color of your skin. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others raising their signs higher in solidarity. I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a black man who has experienced firsthand what so many of you face every day. The fear, the frustration, the anger of being judged, not by your actions, but by your appearance. And tonight, I experienced something that far too many people in this country know all too well, what it's like to be treated as guilty before being proven innocent. The crowd stirred, their voices growing louder in response to his words. Some raised their fists, while others shouted in agreement. This isn't just about me, Miles continued, his voice rising. This is about every black man, woman, and child who has been stopped, questioned, harassed, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. It's about a system that has been built on injustice, a system that protects some while criminalizing others. He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was silent now, hanging on his every word. I'm calling on this department, on this town, and on this country to do better. We cannot continue to allow racial profiling and systemic injustice to define our communities. We need real reform. We need accountability. We need justice. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in a chorus of support. Judge Aaron Miles stood tall, his heart pounding with the weight of the moment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but tonight he had taken a stand that went beyond the courtroom. Tonight he had become a voice for those who couldn't speak, a beacon of hope in the fight for equality. As the cheers filled the air, Miles knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Change was never easy, and the system he was fighting was deeply entrenched. But this moment was the beginning. The world was watching, and he was ready to lead the charge. The country had descended upon the small town, turning what was once a quiet community into the epicenter of a national conversation about race, justice, and accountability. Judge Aaron Miles's wrongful arrest had gone viral, and now his face was plastered across every major news network. The hashtag #TurnJusticeForJudgeMiles trended, and the calls for reform were growing louder by the hour. Inside his home, Judge Miles sat at his dining table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He had barely slept. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, colleagues, and complete strangers offering support and outrage. Some wanted to help him take legal action, others sought interviews, and still others expressed solidarity with the movement sparked by his arrest. Despite the overwhelming support, Miles felt a deep sense of stillness, a quiet introspection that lingered beneath the noise. He had always known the reality of the system, had spent years seeing it from his position on the bench. But now he had felt its weight in a way that was undeniable and unshakable. The front door creaked open, and his wife, Nayen, entered, balancing a basket of freshly picked herbs from the garden. She placed it gently on the counter before sitting beside him, resting her hand softly on his arm. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with tenderness. Miles let out a long sigh, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been thinking about it all night. About everything. It feels surreal." Nayen nodded, understanding. "I watched the press conference," she said softly. "You were incredible. The way you spoke. People are really listening, Aaron. You're making a difference." Miles offered a small, tired smile. "I hope so. But I'm worried that this will just become another story. Something people talk about for a few weeks before moving on. I don't want this to fade away. I want real change." Nayen leaned closer, her eyes locking with his. "It won't fade. Not if you keep pushing. You're not just anyone, Aaron. You're in a position to make that change, and people are looking to you to lead the way." Miles considered her words. She was right. He had the platform, the experience, and now the visibility to push for reform. But where would he even begin? Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again, interrupting the moment. Glancing at the screen, he saw the name of his longtime friend and fellow judge, Marcus Reed. Reed had called several times over the past few days, but Miles hadn't yet returned his calls. He excused himself and stepped into the living room to answer. "Marcus," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Aaron, I've been trying to reach you," Marcus said, his tone urgent yet concerned. "Are you okay?" "I saw the video. I couldn't believe it." "I'm hanging in there," Miles replied, rubbing his temple. "It's been a lot." "I can only imagine," Marcus said, pausing before continuing. "Listen, I've been thinking about everything, and I've spoken to some people, other judges, legal scholars, community leaders. There's a real opportunity here, Aaron, an opportunity to push for systemic change, but we need someone to lead it, someone with credibility, visibility, someone like you." Miles leaned against the wall, absorbing his friend's words. "You're talking about starting a movement." "Exactly," Marcus replied. "This is bigger than just what happened to you. This is about challenging the entire system, holding law enforcement accountable for racial profiling, excessive force, all of it. People are angry, they're engaged, and they're ready to act. But they need leadership. They need someone to help channel that energy into real, tangible change." Miles was silent for a moment, the weight of what Marcus was proposing settling over him. He had spent his career fighting for justice from within the courtroom, but this was different. This wasn't about a single case or ruling. It was about taking on an entire system, one built on generations of inequality and injustice. It was a daunting thought, but also felt like the next natural step. "Are you sure I'm the right person for this?" Miles asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I've spent my whole life in the system. I'm a part of it. How can I lead a movement against something I'm a part of?" "You're exactly the right person, Aaron," Marcus said firmly, "because you've seen it from both sides. You know how it works and how it fails. That perspective is what we need right now. You can help bridge the gap between the people and the system. You can push for reforms that will actually make a difference." Miles closed his eyes, letting Marcus's words sink in. He could feel the pull of something larger than himself, something that had been building for years, not just within him, but across the nation. The protests, the outrage, the calls for justice, they were all part of the same struggle. And now, it seemed, The spotlight had turned to him. The question was he ready to embrace it? Could he lead the charge for systemic change, knowing the enormity of the fight ahead? As he opened his eyes, the answer felt clearer than it had before. The road ahead would be long, but change had to start somewhere. And perhaps, just perhaps, it had started with him. Judge Aaron Miles stood at the head of the conference table, taking in the sight of the people gathered around him. Activists, legal experts, community leaders, and even members of the media, all seated in the room with one shared goal: real, systemic reform. The energy was palpable, a mix of tension, hope, and determination, fueled by the urgency of the moment. The events of the past week had created a flashpoint. The video of his wrongful arrest had not just shocked the nation, it had become a rallying cry for justice. Across the country, people had protested, spoken out, and demanded change. Yet Miles knew that what happened next, what they did in this room, would determine whether this moment would become a catalyst for real, lasting reform or just another fleeting chapter in the ongoing struggle for justice. Marcus, sitting beside him, leaned in, whispering, "You ready for this?" Miles nodded, though the weight of the responsibility pressed on him. He had spent days preparing for this moment, but the magnitude of what was at stake had never felt more real. "I'm ready," he said quietly, before stepping forward. As the room hushed, all eyes turned to him. The conversations faded, replaced by a deep, expectant silence. "Thank you all for being here," Miles began, his voice strong yet controlled. "I know that many of you have been working toward change for a long time, but the events of the past week have brought us to a tipping point. What happened to me is not an isolated incident, it's part of a much larger problem. A problem that has been allowed to fester in our communities for far too long, and now we have an opportunity to do something about it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Miles could feel the energy shift as people leaned in, their focus entirely on him. For years we've been talking about police reform, about racial justice, about accountability. But too often those conversations stall, and the system remains unchanged. He continued, "We can't let that happen this time." He paused, letting his words settle. The faces around the room reflected a mixture of frustration and resolve. Many of these people had fought battles for justice their entire lives. But now, for the first time in a long time, it felt like something could truly shift. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Miles said, his voice gaining strength. "It's about what happens to black men, women, and children every day across this country. It's about the systemic inequalities that have allowed racial profiling, excessive force, and injustice to thrive. It's about building a system that protects everyone, not just the privileged few." The room was completely silent now, hanging on his every word. He could see in their eyes that they were with him, ready to push forward, but also looking to him to lead. "We have momentum right now," Miles continued. "People are angry and they're paying attention, but we can't afford to let this moment slip away. We need to organize. We need to push for specific reforms, policies that will hold law enforcement accountable, that will dismantle systemic racism within our institutions. And we need to do it now, while the world is watching." Marcus nodded in support, and several others around the table followed suit. A few murmurs of encouragement echoed through the room. "I'm ready to lead this fight," Miles said, his voice steady. "But I can't do it alone. We need to work together, to use our collective knowledge, experience, and influence to demand real, lasting change. This is our chance. Our chance to create a future where justice isn't just a word, but a reality for all of us." The room erupted in applause. Miles looked around, feeling the weight of the moment, but also the hope that came with it. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time it felt like the beginning of something that could truly change the world. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a man leading a movement. The momentum was undeniable. The public was watching, and this moment had the potential to become a movement. Maya, a young community organizer who had been leading protests for police accountability for years, leaned forward. Her frustration was unmistakable. "We've had moments like this before," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "After George Floyd, after Breonna Taylor, after so many others. The outrage rises, people protest, and then it fades. How do we make sure this time is different?" Miles nodded, sharing her frustration. "You're right. We've seen this pattern before. But this time we're going to be the ones leading the charge, not just reacting. We need to go beyond protests. We need to push for real, specific reforms, legislation and policies that are enforceable. And we need a unified message that the public can rally around." Maya looked thoughtful but still hesitant. "How do we do that?" "The system is designed to protect itself. Every time we've tried to pass meaningful reform, it gets watered down or blocked. What's going to make this time any different?" Marcus leaned in. "We've been talking to lawmakers, both at the local and national levels," he explained. "We're starting by pushing for a national bill that targets racial profiling and mandates accountability measures in police departments. We need body cameras that are actually used, independent review boards for misconduct, and a transparent disciplinary process that holds officers accountable. But it can't just be about one law," Miles added. "This will take sustained pressure from the public. We need to keep this in the news to make sure people don't forget. That's why we're building a coalition. Activists, legal experts, community leaders, and, most importantly, the people directly affected by this. We're going to keep the pressure on until real change happens." A civil rights lawyer sitting across the table chimed in. "We also need to be ready for pushback from police unions. They're powerful and will fight any attempt to limit their authority. We've seen it before. They'll use every tactic to undermine reform." Miles' expression grew serious. "I know, but we'll be ready. The unions have power, but we have the people. We need to make it clear that this isn't about undermining law enforcement. It's about ensuring they serve and protect everyone, not just some. We're not anti-police. We're anti-police brutality. There's a big difference, and we need that message to be loud and clear." The room fell quiet as the weight of the conversation settled in. They were up against a system that had resisted change for decades, a system designed to shield itself from accountability. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like they had a real shot. "I've been talking to families who've lost loved ones to police violence," Miles continued, his voice softer now. "They've been fighting for justice for years, met only with indifference, delays, and denial. We need to make sure their voices are at the center of this movement. This isn't just about changing laws, it's about changing the culture of policing in this country." At the end of the table, a woman raised her hand. She introduced herself as Angela, a longtime community activist. "I agree with everything you're saying," she began, her voice steady. "But we also need to think long-term. If we're going to push for these reforms, we need to build something that lasts. What happens after the laws are passed? How do we make sure the next generation keeps pushing for change?" Miles nodded. "That's why we're going to invest in education and outreach. Young people need to be part of this fight. They need to understand the importance of civic engagement and activism. We can't just react. We have to be proactive, laying the foundation for future generations to carry this forward." Marcus leaned in again. "We're talking about starting a national coalition, something that can mobilize people across the country, not just in response to incidents, but as a way to keep the pressure on lawmakers at every level, local, state, and national." The room buzzed with energy. People nodded, exchanging ideas, brainstorming ways to get the movement off the ground. It was as if a spark had been lit, and the flame was spreading rapidly. Maya leaned forward again, her skepticism fading. "If we're going to do this, we need to hit the ground running. We need a name, a platform, a website. People need to know where to go to get involved." "I've already started on that," Marcus said with a smile. "We'll have everything up and running within a week." Miles glanced around the room, seeing the determination on every face. This was happening. They were building something real, something that could last. This wasn't just about what had happened to him anymore. It was about every injustice that had been ignored, every family denied justice, every person told their life didn't matter. "We need to make sure every voice is heard," Miles said, his voice resolute. "This isn't just my fight, it's our fight, and we won't stop until we've built a system that's fair, just, and accountable." The room erupted into applause. The fight was just beginning, but Judge Aaron Miles knew they were on the right path. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't a moment that would fade away. It was the start of something bigger than himself, bigger than any one person. As the meeting continued, with plans drafted and strategies debated, Miles felt a sense of purpose like never before. The world had watched him be arrested, judged not by his title or his work, but by the color of his skin. Now the world would watch him lead a movement for justice, one that would challenge the very foundations of the system that had wronged him. And this time, they wouldn't stop until the system changed for good. In the months following Judge Aaron Miles' wrongful arrest, the movement he helped ignite grew larger than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a local incident in a small town evolved into a national reckoning. Rallies, marches, and town hall meetings were held in cities across the country. The coalition Aaron and Marcus built had become a force for change, uniting people from all walks of life under a shared goal: dismantling systemic injustice and holding law enforcement accountable. Judge Miles, now at the forefront of the movement, had become a household name. His story, along with those of countless others who had suffered from racial profiling and police brutality, had become a symbol of the urgent need for reform. Media outlets tracked his every move, and Aaron was soon invited to speak at universities, legal forums, and civil rights events. People wanted to hear his voice, to know what was next, and to understand how they could be part of the change. Yet despite this newfound attention, Aaron remained grounded. The cause had never been about him. It was about the people whose stories were often silenced, those whose names didn't make the headlines but who deserved justice all the same. He had a responsibility to them, and that responsibility weighed heavily on him. As the movement grew, one cool autumn afternoon found Aaron standing on the steps of the courthouse where he had served for years. He had been invited to deliver a speech during a rally calling for statewide police reform. Hundreds filled the courthouse square, their signs held high, their voices full of hope and determination. It was a far cry from the scene months earlier, when Aaron had been handcuffed on the side of a quiet road, treated as a suspect instead of a judge. Standing at the podium, he gazed out over the sea of faces and felt the weight of the moment. This was what they had been fighting for: the opportunity to be heard, to demand accountability, and to refuse to settle for anything less than real, lasting change. "Thank you for being here," Aaron began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for showing up, not just today but every day since this movement began. It's because of people like you that we've made progress, because you refused to stay silent, because you demanded justice when the system tried to deny it." The crowd cheered, their voices a chorus of solidarity. "But we still have a long way to go," Aaron continued. "We've seen too many lives lost, too many families torn apart, and too many communities ravaged by a system that was supposed to protect them. We've seen officers walk free after committing violence. We've seen investigations delayed and buried. And we've seen laws passed that do more to protect those in power than the people they're sworn to serve." The crowd's mood shifted, their cheers turning into murmurs of agreement and frustration. "I know you're angry," Aaron said, his voice rising. "I'm angry too. But we can't let that anger consume us. We have to turn it into action. Real, tangible action that leads to change. That's why we're here today. We're not just asking for reform. We're demanding it." A wave of applause echoed across the square. "The time for incremental change is over," he declared. "We need bold, comprehensive reform that addresses the root causes of injustice. We need laws that hold officers accountable, that ensure transparency in every department, and that protect the rights of every person, no matter the color of their skin." As Aaron spoke, he could see the faces in the crowd, young and old, black and white, all united in their demand for a better future. Among them were families who had lost loved ones to police violence, their pain etched into their expressions, but their resolve unshakable. Aaron had met with many of them in the weeks leading up to the rally, listening to their stories, sharing in their grief, and understanding their sorrow. "We've made some progress," he continued, "but we can't stop here. We have to keep going. We have to keep pushing. We have to make sure that this moment turns into a movement that will last for generations." At the edge of the crowd, Aaron spotted Maya, the community organizer who had been one of the first to join the coalition. She had been a fierce advocate for police reform long before his arrest, and in the months since, she had become one of the movement's most visible leaders. She gave him a small nod of encouragement, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Aaron's mind flashed back to the countless meetings they had held since the movement began. Long hours spent strategizing, building alliances, and drafting policy proposals that they hoped would make a real difference. It had been exhausting work, but also the most rewarding of his life. He turned back to the crowd and continued. "We've seen what happens when we come together. We've seen laws passed in states across the country that ban chokeholds, that require body cameras, that create independent oversight of police departments. But those laws are just the beginning. We need more. We need to reimagine what public safety looks like, and we need to build a system that truly works for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause once more, their energy feeding into Aaron's resolve. He could feel the power of the moment, a sense that something real was happening, something that couldn't be easily undone or ignored. "For too long the system has operated without accountability," Aaron said. "But we're changing that. We're holding those in power accountable, and we won't stop until every community in this country is safe, not just from crime, but from the very people who are supposed to protect them." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We stand here today not just to remember the lives that have been lost, but to honor them by fighting for a future where no one else has to experience that pain. We stand here to demand that our voices be heard, and that the system that has failed so many is finally reformed." As Aaron looked out over the crowd, he felt a swell of pride. This movement, this moment, it was bigger than any one person. It was the culmination of years of struggle, of countless lives lost, and of the unwavering commitment of people who refused to give up. The applause was deafening now. Aaron stepped back from the podium as the next speaker prepared to take the stage. Marcus joined him at his side, clapping him on the back. "You were brilliant, Aaron," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with pride. "This is just the beginning." Aaron nodded, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline of the speech. "It's bigger than me now, Marcus. This is everyone's fight." "That's what makes it powerful," Marcus replied, "because it's no longer about one case, one man, or even one movement. It's about changing the system for good." As the rally continued, Aaron and Marcus quietly slipped away from the crowd, making their way toward the edge of the square where the media had gathered. Reporters shouted questions, eager for sound bites and headlines, but Aaron wasn't interested in the attention anymore. He had given his speech, and now it was time to focus on the real work ahead. "Do you think they'll listen?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now as they stood back, watching the rally from a distance. "They'll have to," Aaron replied, his gaze fixed on the sea of determined faces. "We're not giving them a choice." In the weeks that followed, the movement gained even more momentum. Lawmakers who had once been hesitant to address police reform now found themselves under immense pressure to act. Bills were introduced in state legislatures across the country, many of them modeled on the proposals Aaron and his coalition had drafted. The media continued to cover the movement, and the public's demand for change showed no signs of waning. But Aaron knew that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough to pass laws. They had to be enforced. And even more challenging than changing policy was the task of changing the culture of policing itself. That, Aaron realized, was the hardest battle of all, changing hearts and minds. Late one evening, after another long day of meetings and phone calls, Aaron sat alone in his home office. He stared at the framed photos on his desk, Pictures of his family, of his children, of the life he had built. It was a life he was proud of, but also a life that had been shaken to its core by the events of the past few months. He thought about the future, about the kind of world his children would grow up in. Would they still have to fear the very people who were supposed to protect them? Or would the work he was doing now help create a future where justice truly meant something? As he sat there, the weight of everything he had fought for pressing down on him, Aaron realized something. This fight, this movement, it wasn't just about him or even about his generation. It was about the future. It was about creating a world where his children and all children could grow up without fear. And that was a fight worth fighting for, no matter how long it took. With renewed determination, Aaron stood up from his desk. There was more work to be done, but for the first time in a long time he felt a deep sense of hope. Real hope, not just for himself but for the world they were building, one step at a time.